Thank you, Paul. What I'm going to try and do is inspire you to take your rightful place in this government. Well, Paul touched on it. He talked about how we had the first constitution of any of the colonies. It's actually a much bigger statement than that. On December 21st, 1775, our legislature sat down to write a constitution. They did so because they had scared Governor Wentworth out of the colony. He had been harboring a loyalist militia officer, and the people wanted to, I don't know, probably ride him out of town on a rail, and they rolled a cannon up to the governor's front door. And in July, and he, I don't know whether he turned the officer over or not, but after that point, he decided that probably New Hampshire was not the place he wanted to be, and he left and went to Nova Scotia, where he again became the royal governor. But now we have a state where effectively New Hampshire is without a government, and they started having problems with anarchy in the outlying areas of New Hampshire. And so our legislature got together in on December 21st, kind of just before Christmas. I guess other legislatures take Christmas off, but they decided to stay in session. And by January 5th, 15 days later, they had produced a government, the first government in the history of the world, created by a written constitution. That is enormously significant. Now, this was not a constitution ratified by the people. And they wrote it as a temporary document to tide them through this unhappy conflict, as they coined it. But it's interesting to look at why they formed this government. And this is really the nugget of what we're driving at with CACR 26. Or question 2, as you'll see it on the ballot. Why did we form New Hampshire? The sudden and abrupt departure of His Excellency John Wentworth, Esquire, our late governor, and several of the council, leaving us destitute of legislation, and no executive courts being open to punish criminal offenders, whereby the lives and properties of the honest people of this colony are liable to the machinations and evil designs of wicked men. Therefore, for the preservation of peace and good order, and for the security of the lives and properties of the inhabitants of this colony, we conceive ourselves reduced to the necessity of establishing a form of government. The purpose of the government of New Hampshire is to punish injustice. The sole purpose. Everything else we do up in Concord, building bridges, providing roads, helping the poor, whatever else we may do, it is all secondary to that first purpose of providing justice. Providing statutes that provide a fixed law so that people know when they are breaking the law, or what might cause them to break the law, an executive department to apprehend the evildoers, and a judiciary to mete out justice. That's why we're there. A few years later, the war, it being apparent that the war was not going to drift away as they thought it all would, in '79, we again had a first. Now, all our first constitution, all of the constitutions of the other states, were created by their legislatures, not by the people. John Langdon, Speaker of the Assembly at that point, decided to try something new, a constitutional convention. Why is this important? When you have a constitution written by the legislature, it is a constitution that is perceived from the power of government. When you have a constitution written by an external body, it may include legislators, it probably does, but it includes people who are not legislators. And therefore the power that they're dealing with is viewed not as the power of the government, but the power of the people. The first constitutional convention in the history of the world, July of 1779. Massachusetts did not hold theirs until September. We rejected our first proposed constitution, in part because the Bill of Rights was too small. It had only 7 articles. And because it was a recodification of that concentrated form of government that they had, an assembly, a House of Representatives, from which was chosen an executive council, from which was chosen a chief executive, a president of the state, who also happened to be the Chief Justice of the courts. And they thought this was a little overly concentrated. The second, so 2 years later, that was rejected in 1781. They proposed a new one with pretty much the Bill of Rights that we have now, other than the amendments we've made in the last 200-odd years, and what I would call a truly American form of government with a directly elected executive, House of Representatives, and a Senate. People looked at that, they said, that's radical. That's way too radical for us. So the third try kept the same Bill of Rights, but with a more parliamentary form of government. House, Senate, Executive Council, comprised of 3 members of the House and 2 members of the Senate, elected in joint session. Secretary of State and Treasurer elected by the legislature in joint session, and a directly elected president who was also the president of the Senate and a voting senator. That's what the people approved. That's a long way of saying we are the only jurisdiction that has ever rejected a proposed constitution. We are unique. We rejected 2 proposed constitutions. We are a persnickety people, as some people say. Now, where does that power in government come from? You all easily would say, well, where does the power in government come from? Somebody shout out. How do you know? It says so. All power residing originally in and being derived from the people. All the magistrates, executive department, judges, and officers of the government are their substitutes and agents and at all times accountable to them. The power we wield and conquered is not ours, it is yours. We are your representatives. When we are in Concord, we are your deputies. A deputy is somebody who exercises all the power of the office holder. We are your deputies. We propose and pass laws that presumably you want, and if you don't, you replace us. Who is the final judge of the meaning of the Constitution? How do you know? It says so, right. Article 39, what was originally the last article in our Constitution. It is great. Not only does it affirm the power of the people to interpret the Constitution, not the judges, it also gives you a voter's guide. Article 38. And you have to understand, recur. Recur means to read, study, and discuss. The Constitution is not a document written for lawyers to interpret. I'm an engineer. The Constitution was written for the people to ratify. Therefore, the people must be able to understand it. And it says, a frequent recurrence to the fundamental principles of the Constitution, to read, study, and discuss. It should be, what you talking about in Walmart? I do. And a constant adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, industry, and frugality are indispensably necessary to the preservation of liberty and good government. Not a good idea, not convenient, indispensably necessary. You must know your Constitution. If you don't know your Constitution, how do you interpret it? How do you enforce it? The next phrase is the voter's guide. The people ought therefore, and ought is the moral imperative, the people ought therefore to have a particular regard to those principles in the selection of their officers and representatives. So you're to use that document, the Constitution, as a measure of whom you set and conquered. You see your prospective representatives at the polls, and they say, "Oh, vote for me." How many parts are there to the Constitution? If they don't know, don't vote for them. So what do you think about Article 8? What does it mean to you? If they don't know what Article 8 is, that they're dealing with your power, don't vote for them. And they, the people, have a right to require of their lawgivers and magistrates, executive department, judges, an exact and constant observance of them, those principles, in the formation and execution of the laws necessary for the good administration of government. I love finding these little hooks in there. It's the administration of government. We aren't the government. You're the government. We're the administrators. We're the hirelings. We're up there doing your will. We're executing your power. Now, we are also members of the community, so, you know, when we're in Concord, we're executing 1/400th of 1/2 of the power. In the community, we hold 1/1,000,000th of the power, a little less than. But that's how this Constitution was meant to be looked at. Now we come to CACR 26, or question 2. Now, until 1964, the legislature had the power to constitute all the judicatories of the state. Every court in the state was at the mercy of the legislature. And in fact, the legislature, from time to time, has wiped all the chess pieces off the board. Usually it was done for political purposes. The legislature and the executive would change hands. You'd go from, well, the equivalent of Republican to Democrat and Democrat to Republican. It's happened 5 times. And each time you'd have, well, the first time was funny. It was 1816. The Republican Democrats take power. They wipe out the judiciary and reconstitute the courts and appoint new judges. And the people did not like the new judges. They continued to go to the old judges. 2 years later, 2 election cycles, the Federalists get reelected. And again, off go the pieces from the chessboard. They create all new courts. 1964, a little late to the table because the last time this had happened was 1873. A little late to the table, but it's proposed in that convention, just so this doesn't happen again, that we create 2 constitutional courts, the Supreme and Superior Courts. They would no longer be at the mercy of the legislature. They would no longer be creatures of the legislature. In 1978, there was another constitutional amendment proposed for the purpose of insulating the judiciary from politics. Article 73A. And Article 73A, well, it reads, and this, it is important how it reads, and I'll have, because it has been misread. Article 73A says, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court shall be the administrative head of all the courts. He shall, with the concurrence of the majority of the Supreme Court justices, make the rules governing the administration of all courts in the state and the practice and procedure to be followed in all such courts. The rules so promulgated shall have the force and effect of law. Now, up until that point, at least throughout the 20th century, the rules for the administration of the courts had been proposed in the superior courts and they'd be handed up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would approve those rules. This resulted in slight discrepancies in the rules from county to county. Interestingly enough, I suspect it would have been possible for the Supreme Court to unify those rules, but they chose not to. However, in order to ensure that the rules in all the counties would be uniform, Article 73A was proposed. Now, in that convention, one of the members, I believe it was Delegate Niswander, was very concerned about that last sentence, rules so promulgated will have the force and effect of law. And he says, now, he says, this won't diminish or the power of the legislature, the power that the legislature currently has to regulate the practice and procedure in the courts, will it? And Delegate Gross says, as far as I can tell, they will have every power they currently enjoy. That's very important. Up until that point, we had made a large fraction, and in the early days of the state, all of the rules for the practice and procedure of the court, down to how much a lawyer might get paid in certain types of routine filings. So we see that in the convention, they had been reassured that this would not diminish the power of the legislature at all. Unfortunately, that last sentence was not included on the ballot in 1978 because it wasn't necessary. The only thing that was required by law was a synopsis or an explanation of the amendment. And it did not include the last sentence. This has caused a great deal of confusion and back and forth in the years since. So much so that in the, I think my first term, 2001, 2002, we did pass a law that said you have to put the amendment on the ballot so the people see what's going to be in the Constitution. Since the adoption of Article 73A, despite the words of Delegates Niswander and Gross, the Supreme Court of New Hampshire has interpreted Article 73A to mean that the legislature has no power to affect the practice and procedure in the courts whatsoever. Now, this is a real problem. Remember, whose power is the court exercising? The people's. If you ever get a chance to read it, Bastiat, the law. Government cannot exercise any power that does not originally reside in the people. Government is merely an aggregate of the power of the people, so it can be wielded more effectively. So if it's your power, and the Supreme Court should write a rule or execute a rule in a manner that you, the people, don't feel is good or just, how do you change it? It is not rational that the government should be able to deny you the power to control your power that they're executing. But that is what the Supreme Court has been doing for the last 30 years. In fact, and this is even more disturbing in my mind, is that during the 1980s, when the legislature was trying to create court rules in regard to contempt of court, the Supreme Court began opining that some of these powers, and particularly because of the inclusion of Article 73A, that these powers, legislative powers they claim, to control the practice and procedure in the courts are inherent to the court, inherent to the judiciary. And I want you to construct what that means. If our Constitution says that all power originates in and is derived from the people, a claim of inherent power is akin to really synonymous with a claim of divine right. They are, in fact, claiming a power of divine right, or divine government by divine power. They wouldn't say it that way. Confronted with it, I don't know how they would react to it. But that's the long and short of it. They perceive their power to control their courts beyond the reach of the people. And that is inherently dangerous to you. The proposed question on the ballot, which is actually the language provided by the judiciary, restores your power to control how your power is executed in the courts through your elected legislature. The Supreme Court is going to say, oh, but there's a separation of powers. And this is one of those things that's really, really interesting. Because Article 37, and that's the wrong part of the Constitution, Article 37, Part 1, I can probably do it pretty close off the top of my head anyway. The three powers of government, to wit, the legislative, executive, and judicial, ought to be kept as separate from and independent of each other as the nature of free government will admit. That recognizes that in order to have free government, there must be an overlap of powers. Or as is consistent with that chain of connection that binds the whole fabric of the Constitution in one indissoluble bond of unity and amity, which is the instruction of how to read the Constitution. In order to read the Constitution correctly, you must look at all of the articles that touch upon the article you're interested in. Because however you interpret it, it must be consistent with all those other articles, because they are one indissoluble bond of unity and amity. They are friendly to each other. They are in agreement. So if you want to find out how one branch of the government relates to another, you read the form of government, and it tells you. It tells you that the legislature is the supreme legislative body. If the legislature is the supreme legislative body, how can the court create a rule with the force and effect of law that the legislature cannot amend? Is that rational?